Hello and welcome to the EFM Health Club podcast. We are here to provide you with everything you need to know about your health and fitness. With me, as always, are both Wade Brady and Jason Jesusius. How are you guys?
Good, thank you.
Justin.
Nice. And we have our first special guest for the podcast ever. We'd like to introduce the head of EFM Australia, Peter Rohde. How are you, Peter?
Very well, thank you. Very pleased to be with you, and I hope I don't kill off your podcast as being your first guest.
Well, yeah, it's only early, but you probably won't do it. It might be us. So, Peter, we always start by, we started by asking each other how we got started with EFM, how we kind of got into the EFM system. You have a long background that we're going to get into, very interesting. How did you get into EFM originally? What made you merge into being involved in the organisation? And what are you doing with it now?
Well, my first movement with EFM was in the 90s. I was coaching SANFL footy in Adelaide, and my wife, we were living in Norwood, and my wife had started attending EFM Unley, which is the very first EFM ever, mainly because David Walk, who was one of the original founders of EFM, also did fitness for me at Norwood, and he got my wife across to EFM Unley about 1996. She just had the last of our three children and wanted to get back into training and exercise, and she started at EFM under the grandstand at Unley Oval in 1996. So that was the first involvement with it, and as I said, David Walk, who's turned out to be a good friend of ours and was one of the founders of EFM, got her involved, and as it turns out, after about 20 years later, David and I were two of the three people that bought the EFM Corporate, the organisation, and David is still involved now as a silent partner with EFM. So originally in 1996, then we moved back to Melbourne in 1999 for 7 or 8 years, and then came back to Adelaide. I continued to work in footy, but Robin and I both went to EFMs then from the mid 2000s through, and then in 2013. We bought EFM Corporate, the three of us, and from 2014, or the end of 2014 onwards, I've been the CEO of EFM. So I'm the one that's tried to herd all the cats and keep all you guys in line for the last 10 years.
Yeah, it's like trying to make a pile of water, right?
Exactly, and my background was always, I did a sports science degree, and I was a phys ed teacher while I was playing footy. Always involved in fitness and intrigued in fitness, and from day one we loved, my wife and I, and she was a phys ed teacher as well, we loved the I suppose the culture of EFM and the difference between, we've been to lots of gyms, we trained ourselves a lot, we're pretty fit and active and all that, but we love the culture more than anything else, being able to go and do exercise. And in those early days my wife used to go with other young mums and they go and have coffee afterwards, and my three children have all gone to EFM, and two of them still do. One of them now lives in the state, but and now their partners go, and so the whole family got pretty involved. And we've always been very committed to the culture of EFM, I suppose, the club rather than just the gym, because anyone can go to a gym and do okay for a while if you're motivated. But my wife, I think, has done 2,000 visits. I haven't done that many, I've got to say. I've never really counted them because I go to different clubs, but she's done 2,000 odd visits, and she goes, she's 60 now, but she goes 4 or 5 times a week. And my daughter, who's just had a baby, was going to the EFM near her up until about a week before she gave birth, and she was back in the gym last night, actually, which is 3 weeks after giving birth. So, and she, of all of our kids and stuff, she was probably the least interested in fitness and exercise, but she's got right into it as well. So it's something something we're very committed to.
Yeah, I'm sure Robin's really appreciative that you outed her age there too, so that's good. She's probably not going to listen.
I do very, very often say that she's much older than me because I'm still in my 50s, but not for very much longer, I might add.
Yeah. So do you think, so from the old days of EFM, has the training changed much? Like you obviously get around now. Is the actual sessions different, or they're reasonably similar?
Look, you'd say the sessions have changed because, things like kettlebells and even slam balls and those sort of things weren't, it was dumbbells and barbells and treadmills and, maybe rowers in the early days. Certainly things like, and a lot of Versa climbers, they've always been popular. But, the new cross trainers, the ski ergos, and especially a lot of the functional fitness has changed. So it's certainly more functional type training. But you wouldn't say the sessions have changed a huge amount in terms of, we talk about the glorious uncertainty of EFM, of when you walk in the door, you're never quite sure what you're going to get. And that's still one of the things we really try to hang on to. So variety is important. You look at the sessions and you'd say that people are doing different things within them, but the overall design and the overall culture, etc., all I think, we've tried to maintain. Certainly technology, things move on. Wearables, My Zones and Apple Watches and all those sort of things, and a lot of that's around the periphery though. Really, the core training stuff is still very similar.
Liberty of digging up your playing career, went deep into the archives, and I came up with some stats. So a quick summary: Rohde, 163 games, 46 for Carlton and 117 for Melbourne. And pull me up if I've got anything wrong here, Pete. Your debut as a 20-year-old for Carlton. You played in 96 wins and 66 losses, only one draw. That's a pretty good win-loss record, Rohde.
Well, yes, and I never really heard that stat before. But look, I was at Carlton at a time when they won a lot of games, played finals, and especially my first few years at Melbourne, we played finals every year. So yeah, I mean, we probably won 2/3 of our games most seasons. It was a pretty competitive environment, but yeah, I started as a 20-year-old. My first couple of seasons were at Carlton, and there's this thing called a salary cap, which for those who know VFL footy, AFL footy now, is pretty serious. But in those days, it wasn't treated all that seriously. But I did get called into the CEO's office, and he said, "There's this thing called the salary cap. We're going to have to move a couple of players on." Well, actually, four of us, one after the other, went in the office, and it was after round one of the season, which these days is sort of unthinkable. And I was the only one of the four to leave. And I can tell you they weren't paying me that much, so I'm not sure how much effect it had on the salary cap. But an interesting story was I played in the reserves for Carlton in the first round and we played against the Bulldogs, and I got cleared after round one. And the next week I played for Melbourne against the Bulldogs in the reserves again. I played on the same guy 2 weeks in a row. And when I walked out and played on him, he looked at me and said, "What the hell are you doing here?" So that's a fun fact. But in those days, people could be cleared during the season. The draft was only just coming in, and it was draft only applied to interstate players, and yeah, they paid transfer fees, and you'd move around during the season.
Different days, but back then. Wade, you're going to get into some footy questions in a sec, but I've got to finish this off. I've got some good stuff here. 28 goals, Pete. A career high 3 goals on the 14th of the 6th, 93 versus Collingwood in a 51-point thumping of the Pies. That day, Alan Jakovic, my favourite player, kicked 9 goals. He dobbed 9, but you chipped in with 3 in an 8-goal win. 2 tackles, 17 possessions, 1 free kick against Rohde. What was that for?
I can't even remember the goals. I can't remember the free kicks against, but it was one of the rare occasions I played in the forward line. I started my career in the midfield and then moved to the back line. So I didn't kick a lot of goals for a long time, but near the end I played up forward a little bit. And my memory of that game was I set Alan Jakovic up for the vast majority of his 9 goals from I remember.
I'm sure you remind him of that too when you see him.
Yes, he was not. I get that he was your favourite player because he was a pretty exciting player on the ground. I'd have to say he wasn't a great bloke off the ground. He wasn't my favourite player.
Over to you, Wade.
On the subject of players, who are some of the best ones? I've asked you before, like I know probably the best one you've played on. Who's a handful of some of the best ones and some of the strongest, I suppose, because you were in the back line most of the time, weren't you?
Yeah, well, in my early days at Carlton, I played with Bruce Dool, who current generation of people probably wouldn't know a lot about, but he was an absolute superstar. He was probably the best I saw. Stephen Kernahan I played with at Carlton, and then I played on him a bit when I went to Melbourne. But in my days at Melbourne, I ended up playing full back and centre half back a lot of the time. So I played on Gary Ablett Senior, who was by far the most talented player I ever played on. He was quite inconsistent, so I did have a few good days on him, but I also had a few very bad days on him. I played on Jason Dunstall and Dermot Brereton. I played on Tony Lockett a couple of times, which I was very physically inept at. but he kicked a lot of goals against us. So I played on some very good players through that period. I would have to say that I played on Wayne Carey a little bit at the start of his career. He was certainly the best player, but Gary Ablett was the most talented in terms of what he could do. He kicked 11 goals on us one day, and he kicked 4 on me in one quarter. So, and I probably just felt inept when I played on those sort of players when they were going well. I would say that against Gary Ablett, I did have a few pretty good days. So it wasn't as though he beat me all the time. Whereas when I played on Jason Dunstall, for example, I always felt like I was pretty competitive, but then I'd walk off the ground at the end, he would have kicked 5 or 6 goals every week. So I could never think I played that well against him. But no, it was an exciting era. It was a different time because it was when everyone played man on man and there was no extra players in the back line. So, I think one season when I played, Ablett, Dunstall and Lockett all kicked more than 100 goals in the one season. Now, it's nearly unheard of for anyone to kick 100 goals these days. No one gets near it. But in those days, there'd be 2 or 3. I think Dunstall kicked 120, 3 or 4 years in a row. So it wasn't a great time in playing full back, is the summary. But the bottom line is they kicked goals on everyone, so it didn't matter. It didn't matter so much.
Yeah. I've got a question on coaching, but before that, your teams now, you've got a few teams now because you've been played for a couple, coached one, and was the footy operations manager. So you've sort of got 3 teams now, haven't you?
I have, yeah. So look, I played at Carlton. I was at Carlton for 5 years. I was at Melbourne for 9. Then I was footy manager at Port for 10. And I also manage a few players these days. So I've got a few players spread around the different clubs as well. My family get a bit upset with me when I say I don't particularly barrack for anyone because I'm quite unemotional at the footy. I spent 30 years of my life going along to footy games, so I don't barrack and jump up and down and rant and rave. My family are mainly Port. Grew up, in the period when I was at Port. Deep down, probably my greatest attachment is to Melbourne because that's where I played mainly, and that's where I finished my footy career. But yeah, I'm a little bit, I suppose I used to like watching good footy, and I still watch a lot of footy, but I don't watch as much bad footy as I used to. When I was working in footy, you had to watch footy all the time. These days, I'm a bit more selective, I'd have to say. But look, deep down, I'd probably say I'm a Melbourne supporter. I did have a couple of years at your mighty Bulldogs in the middle there, Wade, somewhere, but I'm a member of the sacked AFL Coaches Club, so I try to sort of wipe that from my memory, to be honest. Although we're talking about great players before, I possibly think the greatest player I saw was Chris Grant. I didn't play against him, I only coached him, obviously, but I mean, he was 6'5" and amazing athlete. He played like a midfielder. He could have played anywhere on the ground, literally, and he was a great person. He is a great person. He was a great player, and he was probably up there with Wayne Carey, the most talented. The only thing I'll say is that Wayne Carey had a lot more success in finals than what Chris Grant did, and that's probably what splits the two apart more than physically. They were very, very similar.
Yeah, I just remember you telling me once probably the difference between Chris Grant being a household name and not is just didn't quite have that mongrel in him, or however you want to put it, just that killer. He was too nice a bloke in a way.
Yeah. Well, look, not being disparaging to Wayne Carey, but I wouldn't probably want Wayne Carey to marry my daughter, but I was very happy for Chris Grant too. So that probably sums up the difference. Well, physically, they were very similar on the football field. Maybe Wayne Carey had some traits that perhaps made him a better player in some ways, but not necessarily a better person.
I could easily talk about Bulldogs greats all day, but I better bring it back to coaching. So, when did you think coaching might be in? Like when you were playing, when were you standing in the back pocket or at full back and thought, hang on, I reckon coaching would be a great idea?
Look, it's something I was always interested in. When I played like state and national basketball when I was a junior. I used to coach junior basketball teams when I was 15. I'd coach 11 and 12-year-olds, so I always liked it. Then I went to university and did sports science and coaching there, and I was a teacher for a while, phys ed teacher. So I always had an interest in coaching. And towards the end of my career, certainly the last couple of years, I was thinking a lot about. I spent a bit of time in the coach's box. I spent a bit more time sitting in the grandstand rather than playing, Wade. So it actually gives you a bit more time to think about it. But yeah, no, I was really ready to coach when I finished playing footy. And in fact, I was looking forward to it. And I retired I think I was about 30, about to turn 31. I could have played for another year or two, but I wasn't the greatest athlete, amongst AFL players. So I knew it was going to be hard work, and I was very keen to get on to the next phase of my life. So that's where I ended up at Norwood in the SANFL.
I probably skipped a bit about go back to playing days. Like what I was going to ask before, what would a day or a week have looked like from a training and preparing perspective? I know now it's pretty much full time, which it'd be good to hear the difference between what it was like when you played and now. But what would a day or a week have looked like when you were playing compared to now for the average player?
Well, everyone talks about the good old days. I would say I played in the good old days. First of all, from a financial point of view, I use this comparison. I was a teacher. I was a student first of all, and then a teacher for all the time I played. My last year that I played, we actually trained 2 afternoons a week at 2:00. So I only taught 4 days a week in my last year. But up till then, I taught full time and then trained and played footy out of hours. And pretty much all those years, I earned a very similar amount from playing footy than what I did from being a teacher. So in today's dollars, a teacher, I don't know, earns about 100,000. So it'd be the equivalent of earning $100,000 playing footy and $100,000 teaching. I always wrote on my tax return that I was a teacher, because I always thought footy was not a professional footballer, was a bit of a wank to say you're that, and it didn't have a great long-term future. So my profession was always a teacher, but I earned similar amounts of money. So my typical day was I'd work as a teacher all day, and then I'd nick off early if I could from work, and we'd start training at 5:00. In my last couple of years, a lot of the people that I played with didn't work, or in my last year, there was only 2 of us that were working what you call full time. The other guy is a guy called Glenn Lovett, who was a really good player but had a lot of injuries, but he ended up being a very high in Nike, Australia and international, and he still runs an international sports marketing company now. So he did the right thing by sticking to his full-time job. But yeah, my day would be 4 nights a week probably. I'd go from working as a teacher to training. And in those days, in terms of volume of training, we trained really, really hard. Like we did a lot. We trained for 2 or 3 hours, 2 nights a week. They actually train less now in terms of volume than what we did back in those days. Like in the pre-season, I remember one pre-season at Carlton, we would train Monday, Wednesday, Friday, do footy for a couple of hours. Tuesday and Thursday we'd do weights for an hour and a half or so, and then on Friday night we do a 10K time trial at the end of training to finish off the week. Then we'd come in on Saturday morning and do more weights. So it was a pretty it was very, very torturous training. It was almost a theory that more was better. Today, the fitness people would say a lot of the training we did was a waste of time. But the game has changed in that it's so much more explosive and powerful. So they don't do anywhere near the long volume of training that we used to do. Now with GPS on footballers and stuff, they know exactly how much distance they cover, at what speeds, and in what intensity bands, etc. And that's how they train. Whereas in our day, we just ran mile after mile after mile. Now, mind you, it was before interchange, so when there was interchange, it was hard to use. So you went out the ground, you played the whole day, you didn't come off. You didn't have a rest. Whereas these days, the midfielders come off twice a quarter. So therefore, they don't run as far in total distance, but they do it much more explosively. Whereas when we did it, we probably looked like draft horses, just jogging, moving our way around the ground. The other big thing that's changed in AFL footy is that the number of stoppages has gone through the roof. So there's a lot more stoppages in the play, which means everyone gets a chance to regroup and get, reposition. But it means when the ball gets put back into play, everyone's rested and goes more powerfully. So the collisions, the speed and the intensity, despite what us old-timers say, is much greater now than whatever it was. But in our day, certainly endurance-wise, we were, we would run, we'd run 15 kilometres a game, most of the midfield players, whereas now the most anyone runs is about 12 or 13. But it's spread more evenly across the team because they interchange more, and it's certainly at a much higher, more intense period. So, today's players are all full-time. They get 1.5 days a week off during the week. So they have one full day where they can't be called into the club. They have another half day where they're supposed to go off and study or work or whatever. They do a lot more weights, a lot more recovery, a lot more, Pilates and yoga and core training. Whereas in our days, it was pretty much just footy training, weights and running. That was it. We'd have an occasional meeting here and there, but the thought of Pilates or yoga, unless it involved a few beers at the pub afterwards, I'm not sure anyone would have been, they would have laughed at you otherwise. It's a very different era, but, I might argue that we had a better balance in our life. Not everything was about footy, and, we certainly were better prepared for life after footy, etc. So, everyone talks about the changes in the time. The money in it these days is certainly much different. But, I as a player manager, and then I worked in admin for 10 years, I also see that what happens to players if they're in the system for 5 or 6 years. They don't make a huge amount of money unless they really make it as a player. Then they go back to university or a trade or whatever, and they're a long way behind their peer group. So, it's not all beer and skittles as such, but it's a wonderful opportunity for people, and it's a great career if you can get in it and stay in it.
Is a lot of the week taken up for the modern footballer sitting down and looking at analytics and analysing the other team and your performance on the tape? And like, I'm sure there was very minimal of that when you played, because it's just funny how they spend so much more time at the footy club now, but they train less. It's just, they must be doing something. They must, like, it can't be just all recovery. There must be a lot of other stuff, like are they dealing with psychs, like talking to people about their mental health and all this? Like, what else do they fill their week up with?
There's a lot more of the mentoring and wellness, all that sort of stuff. The big change in the game, I think, happened about 2000, was when they started to digitise all the vision, and they got vision from behind the goals as well as what you see in television. You look at it from the side. They introduced digitised computers and software, etc., where you can actually just identify bits of play, and they'd match up the side-on vision with the behind-the-goals vision. If ever you go to a game of AFL footy, you watch it from the side, or what you see on television is the entertaining bit. If you sit behind the goals, you get a long way from the ball, but you actually see what happens in the lead up to the play, and you see strategically what happens a lot more away from the ball. So that was the big thing in the 2000s. They introduced computers. They would have on the screen but behind the goals and the side-on vision at the same time, and they also tagged all the incidents in the game. So instead of sitting and having to watch, when I coach Norwood, we'd get a videotape out, and I might find 10 spots in the video I wanted to show them something. We'd have to fast forward through and find it and write down the times, and it was very hard work. But in the early 2000s, they started to digitise it. So they have people that tag every mark, kick, handball, everything. A lot of things happen off the ball, a lot of incidents. So you can actually just, around about the mid-2000s, you got to the stage where you push a button, you can look at all the centre bounces or Wade, if you were playing every kick you had or every mark you took or every involvement you had, you could put it in a package. You could watch it in 10 minutes. Now, you might watch it in 5 minutes, Wade, if it was you. You never know. But, even the best players, it might go for 20 minutes. And it just makes it so much more efficient. And not only that, though, then you can go and say, okay, we're playing the Crows this week, so I'm likely to play on Justin Werry. So I can go to that game and I can look at all of his involvements from the week before or the weeks before. So it just become so much more possible to analyse and know what was going on, and things like line coaches use it for, this is what they do at centre bounces. This is how they set up at kick-ins. There's more tools to actually analyse the game. Now, I reckon somewhere in the last 15 or 20 years that reached overkill. And there's certainly the feedback from players was, there's a certain element of learning what's going on, but there's a certain element of just let me go and play. So and different. And they when people come in, they do psych testing and stuff on them and understand how they learn and how much they learn and how they were at school. I managed 3 or 4 Indigenous players and a couple of them didn't really go to school very much, and the thought of them sitting down in a meeting for an hour and a half watching vision, and they fall asleep literally before and they wouldn't mind me saying the fact that they like a little bit of the analytics and all that, but the best bit is go and throw the ball up and off we go, and making up things go along. So football's a very open, unpredictable sport that coaches try and make as closed and as predictable as you can. And that works really well right up until the shit hits the fan, in a game or whatever. All of a sudden, things change. You've got to be able to think on your feet as well. So, it's interesting comparing to the American sports. AFL people went to the NFL for years and years and just studied what they did and all their plays and all that sort of stuff. The thing about the NFL is it's a closed sport where you sit down and you talk about it, you have a break between each play, everyone knows what everyone's doing. So it's fairly predictable. The great thing I think about AFL is it's an odd-shaped ball. It's continuous. There's not too many stoppages, and you've got to make it up as you go along to some degree. So all coaches have tactics and theories and all that, and try and drill it in and know how to play and all that. But then the ball gets bounced, and then coaches would say then the bloody players start thinking for themselves, and anything can happen. But that to me is one of the great things about the game. So
refreshing.
I hope I've answered your question. The week is a lot about training. It's not about volume of training. It's a lot more about recovery. There's certainly a lot more rehab and core and trying to avoid injuries. And there's a fair amount of analytics, but it's not hours and hours and hours of the analytics stuff. The coaches probably say hours and hours, but their task is to present to the players stuff that is really relevant and tight and precise, and and have the players fresh. The greatest challenge is recovering and getting players ready to play 25 times in a row. The hardest thing I think about the AFL is it's a long game, it's very physical, and the season's very long. And you might argue at the end of the season, the team that wins isn't the one that everyone thinks that someone takes off and plays really well in the finals. I might tend to argue the team that wins at the end is the one that doesn't drop off the most at the end of the year, physically especially, because they get bashed up. And I see that in NRL as well, is they get to the end of the season, a lot of the players have got tape all over them and are looking pretty tired. To me, it's a lot to do with who can be fresh and ready to play, as the season rolls on. They look like they're going better than everyone else, but the argument might be that they're just not going as bad as some of the others, physically towards the end of the year. And I think that's a great thing about both NRL and AFL is whilst each game is important, it's also a bit of a game of attrition as the season goes on. And Justin, I watch what the Panthers have done, and I don't watch a lot of rugby league, but I love watching from outside what they've done, and they've had such a good team. I think that they've been able to bring in fresh players. Ivan Cleary's come back a couple of years in a row now at the end of the season and dominated, but the rest of the team have got them through the year. And Melbourne Storm were a bit like that this year as well. They had people injured a lot of the year. So it's becoming more of a, one player can dominate a game still, I suppose, but you need a really good depth of players, and that to me is the way both competitions are going.
Yeah, and basketball and EPL as well. I think they're all the same. Like Jace would know. Joel Embiid. I've been doing some research for my fantasy basketball, and apparently, how many games in NBA season? Apparently, Joel Embiid is only going to play about 50 odd of the how many?
82.
82. So, because they want him cherry ripe for finals, which he's never been before. He's always banged up and going in about second gear by the time the finals come around. So, yeah, I think it's right across all the professional sports that chase a ball anyway.
It's very brave and very hard for a coach to say, this is my best player, I'm not going to play him this week. And he's fit to play, but maybe in the long-term planning, it's better off if you don't. Geelong did that really well in the AFL a couple of years ago. They won a lot of games early in the year, 2022, I think it was. Coming towards the finals, they rested Selwood and Dangerfield, and they lost a game or two that, that potentially that they could have won. But they got them all back into the finals, all especially their older players had been rested up a bit and all played well through the finals, whereas they probably knew they're going to play 23 games and then all the finals, that as the season finishes, their performance would be going downhill normally. So that's really smart.
Jason? Jason.
You're right, mate. So I had a couple of things, Pete. You talked about the, I guess, what gets measured gets done. There's so much analysis and so much that's measurable. Just relating it back for our listeners, with fitness as well now, there's so many things we can do to measure what we're doing. In our clubs, we use MyZone. That's quite a simple tool for measuring our performance. And, go to things like running apps and strength training apps to track your progress and make sure you're not training too hard, make sure you're training enough. Yes, what gets measured gets done, but would we agree, fellas, as an element like in footy where Pete's saying just throw the ball up in the air, sometimes you just got to go and train and move your body and do what feels right, as opposed to getting too caught up in loving the stats and living your life by the data, so to speak. Am I onto something there, or should we be measuring and analysing everything?
I think like the guys that have safety, people want to put on muscle mass, stick to their 4-day split program, for example, and just keep banging it out over and over and over and over again and upping the weights without doing any flexibility or mobility or stability kind of work. You're going to get to a point where to use the to follow the theme of football, you get to the end of your season, you get to the end of your 6-month progress, and yes, you're a little bit more muscly, but you can't move your shoulders, you can't lift overhead because everything is so tight. You haven't given your body a bit of time to recover. A little bit underrated, I think. Yeah.
So kind of like what Pete's saying, like there's got to be a plan and there's got to be a structure and an outline to how you're going about your training. I guess my ultimate question is there a point of over-analysis Yes, the information's good. Yes, the data's good. Yes, it's important to track and measure, but can we get too caught up in the data? Is that a thing, or is it a case of more is better?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, particularly, we had the podcast last week on running. Everybody's checking their per kilometre time and trying to beat if you're trying to beat previous times, or you can get too into it as opposed to just going out there and doing the training. You know, following a training program. I'm supposed to rest today, but it's probably going to rain tomorrow. So I'll go and run in the rain rather than just go out and just do your training. Yeah, I think so. Particularly, I see it a lot in running.
Yeah, I think some measurement is motivational and adds to it, but I don't think long term that's going to sustain it. I think in the end, Wade said about movement before. I think it's a lot to do with movement patterns and being able to keep your quality of life and all that sort of stuff. And certainly the volume of training, the wearables we have these days can count calories and METs and everything else. So I think people get feedback from that, but that itself isn't going to motivate you. I mean, I ran a lot when I played footy. I never, ever enjoyed running when I played footy. It was always a task because you get set to go and run in the off-season and you have to do this in this much time. And I never ran without a stopwatch, and I always wrote it all down, and these are the runs I did. But I did it because I had to, and I found it wasn't motivating, it was demotivating. I reckon I did that for about 3 months when I finished playing, and I thought, what the hell am I doing this for? Who cares? I stopped wearing a watch when I ran, and I started to enjoy it. And that was the day that I think I can almost remember the day. I was like, I'm doing this because I want to do it. And if this run I'm normally doing 27 minutes, if it takes me 28 minutes, who really cares? Like, I've still done the run, and I'm getting old and all that sort of stuff. Whereas I always had to go better. I always knew what stage of pre-season I could do. I had 3 or 4 different runs I did all the time, and I compare. And I took my watch off, stopped wearing it, stopped writing down the times. And all of a sudden, I started to enjoy running, and I enjoyed it for the next 30 years, where I would honestly say all the time I played footy, I only ever run as a chore. But I knew running was the best, one of the best all-body general, and I wanted to keep doing it, but I didn't want to feel as though I had to push myself to every limit every time I ran.
Absolutely. So we're advocates at EFM, I guess, of making the training fun and bringing that element. Is that with these professional footballers, Pete, you'd have your finger on the pulse with this, I guess. Do they still find the game fun? Because that's why we play, isn't it? We originally started playing because the game is fun. Is footy fun for an AFL player?
Is it still a game, an actual game?
Well, that's a very philosophical, deep question. What I will say is that when I played, we worked, we had relationships outside of sport, we had balance. And we really wanted our team to win. We did get paid, and some of us got paid better than others, obviously, in those days. But that wasn't the motivation for it. And keeping your spot on the list for the next year was not as important as it is now. Because if you're an AFL footballer, in some ways you're competing against your teammates. Your team has to have success, but also you've got to stay on within your team. And I think that they don't have the balance in their lives. That's one of the big problems. I've always encouraged all the players I deal with and everything to have hobbies, to have careers being developed outside of footy, so they've got something to look forward to, because otherwise it becomes a business. And I used to always say to the coaches when I was footy manager at Port, the most important thing is when the players are driving to the ground or flying or on the bus to the ground or whatever on the weekend, they've got to be fresh and looking forward to it, because at the end of the day, they've got to get out and play the game. So I would strongly suspect that the level of enjoyment or fun that players have these days is totally linked to success and failure, because only one team can win each weekend. Funnily enough, whatever happens to be sport the whole time. At the end of the year, only one team wins a premiership. So they're the only one that is seen as being really successful. So I worry about the pressure people get put under, and part of it is because, there's 2 things to it. I think it's their whole life, so they haven't got anything else outside of sport. And also the social media and the 24/7 nature of these days is they can't switch off. My favourite thing to say to players when I was at Port and the ones I manage now is your social media has an on-off button. And if it's causing you stress, then just turn it off. You don't have to be involved in it, but it's easier said than done for I feel like one of those old grey funny daddies for the the generation coming through now. It's easier said than done. They can't wait to get on and interact. And we all know that 2/3 of what goes on social media is negative. It's a negative world. And unfortunately, the idea of playing sport for fun and professional sport are not that closely linked, I'd suggest.
Maybe not the fact you're not allowed to go down the pub and connect anymore as a professional footballer. You're looking for other ways to connect. There's a lot happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very deep question, and it obviously affects professional sport, but outside of that as well, just across society these days, the concept of how people interact and how they get enjoyment and how they relax is changing. And I think a lot of people struggle to find their niche of how they can switch off. And the on-off button on your phone is probably a very good place to start. Now, mind you, when we're doing a podcast, it's probably not the right time to say that, but having an on-off button is important.
We're bringing the information to the people, Pete.
Yeah. So if we go to, so you've mentioned coaching a fair bit there, Pete.
Well, I coached for 4 years in the SNFL and then 5 years in the AFL, 3 years as assistant coach and 2 as a senior coach. So I was only the senior AFL coach for 2 years, which was about 1 3/4 years too many. But so I coached for about 9 years. But then when I was at Port, I was a footy manager. So I worked with the coaches every day when I did that as well. I see coaching. Coaching is just a fancy word for, and it's like teaching. It's all mentoring. It's all communicating and being a leader, I suppose, to develop people, whether it's in the classroom or whether it's in the footy field or whether it's problematic franchisees like you three.
So if you look at the most current premiership coach, Fagan, he didn't even play the game at the highest level. So he was a teacher. He was another one that was a teacher, and so how would you explain? What were his strengths? He must just be able to connect with every single person around.
It's very unusual in AFL for people that don't play to become AFL coaches. He's the first one ever, I think, to not have played. He's older than me. I think he's in his early 60s. He's been around for a long time. He was a very successful player in Tasmania, so he played 250 games in the league or whatever, and he came across him. He's had to do a long apprenticeship. Took a long time for someone to appoint him. He is, to me, he's the typical EPL coach. Like, he's been a lifetime in football. He's played at a lower level. He's coached for a long time. He's done management roles, and the AFL industry is very immature in that way. That when Michael Voss, Hurd, and Buckley, all the superstar players, they all come out of the game. They did a year or two as assistant coaches or some very small apprenticeship, and then got appointed senior coaches. Who would really think that they've got the skills to coach an AFL team, other than the fact they were bloody good players? And might have been also very good captains, but it's very different to actually having to coach. Whereas the way that the EPL has done it over the years, and the NFL in America, most of the coaches, they become coaches at 50 of top NFL teams. They do line coaches, they do coach college, or in Europe in soccer they go and coach at minor leagues and become development and run academies, and they have a real background and they have a skill set in coaching, and then they become coaches and later on in their life. And to me, Fagan is, I think it's a great thing that he's had success because the players love him. He's more mature. He's got life experience, and he's got skills that actually, to manage people, to coach people, and to teach, which I think is what you need. But unfortunately, the AFL world, and I think the NRL is similar, the star players have this aura about them that people can't wait to appoint them as coaches. And I don't think it does them a service. Like people like, Buckley and Hurd probably would be better off to spend 5 or 8 or 10 years learning to coach somewhere, and they might still be coaching now. I think Voss is a better coach the second time round than he was the first time round, clearly.
Well, I was going to ask that question to Jace. Do you think you were a better coach, an EFM coach, when you started, or do you reckon you're better now?
Oh, yeah. So, good question, because I stepped away from EFM for a few years in the middle, and I was definitely better the second time I came back. And it wasn't because I knew more about fitness; it's because I knew more about people and adults and life and like what Pete said, mentoring. So yeah, it's the soft skills that you learn and you pick up as you go. So, Pete, I wanted to ask who you drew inspiration from as a coach. You said you wanted to be a coach from a young age. You realized that fairly early on. Who did you look at and pick bits from, whether it was from a training drills perspective or from an attitude or headspace perspective, who did you draw from?
You probably draw a lot from all the people who. Okay, I had an underage coach. I remember was very influential. But when I went to Carlton, David Parkin was the coach there. He was a lecturer in phys ed. He helped me get into my phys ed degree. He was great friends with my most recent senior coach that I had in Bendigo before I left. He was very analytical, sports scientist. Something that I in all areas really admired. He's very organised, pretty could be pretty aggressive and pretty upfront at times, but he also had a warmer side to him. So, he probably had the most effect on me. But all the coaches. I mean, John North, who I had at Melbourne for a long time, was very successful. He wasn't very analytical at all. He was very emotional, but very much a player's game. He'd carry on and rant and rave a fair bit, but wouldn't say much. I used to say to him. And then I had Neil Baum after him, and he was the opposite. Neil Baum was a thug as a footballer. He was fearsome on the ground, very quiet off the ground as a coach. Very, very subjective, very matter of fact. I used to say to him occasionally, Barney, all you have to do is jump up and down once or twice, and everyone will shit themselves and off they'll go. But that just wasn't the way he was. So, I think I learned things from all the coaches. You sort of pick bits and pieces out of them all. But I have to say that Parkin, because he was my first senior coach, and because he was sports scientist, and a lot of things that I sort of come to admire, he stood for. So he was probably the most influential one.
So obviously there's a lot of pressure as an AFL coach, even at every level, assistant coach, head coach. How do you deal with the day-to-day pressures? And because it's almost like being a player, right? You want to keep your job, you like doing what you're doing. And then how does that, I guess, translate to the average person struggling to kind of, with their job, get through feeling completely under pressure?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really good question. As a player, I think you're always positive. You're always looking forward to next week. I don't think players feel as much pressure as coaches, because it's all about going out and playing. And fans tend to. I have a saying that is that players win games and coaches lose them. You read the media when normally when they go well, it's how good was that player, and when they lose, it's the coach should have done this. And the pressure as a senior coach, and maybe I felt it too much, but think about at the time I was living in Melbourne coaching the Bulldogs. I said to someone that it's big in sport when you get a job, when you get appointed, your name's all over the back page of the Herald Sun, which is true when that happens in Melbourne. Your news of the day for the whole day, which doesn't happen very often. You use it, and depending what happens along the way, you might be all over the back page more than once. But I said, it's really a big sport is when you get the sack and you're on the front page of the paper. That's when it's a really big news. And I remember when I got the sack of the Bulldogs, I had 3 TV crews out the front of my house for a couple of days, wanted me to make some sort of statement. And I, of course, ignored them. My wife, she offered to go and make them cups of tea. And I said, what on earth are you going to do that for? That'll just encourage them to stay longer. We want them to nick off. So you're really in a big sport when you get sacked and you're on the front page of the capital city newspaper. But look, the pressure, and I battled with it my last few months at the Bulldogs. In some ways, the pressure becomes too great. It's really hard to function because, like I said, with the players, when you come along each week to play, you've got to be relaxed and ready to go and feel like you're ready to play a game. Whereas there were certainly times at the Bulldogs at the end where I felt just exhausted. I couldn't sleep, and it does become overpowering. And coaching teams weren't as big in those days, so a lot more of it came back to the senior coach. But I still strongly suspect that when things are going badly, even now, is that all the focus is on the senior coach, and it's unhealthy. And that's another reason why I think that I was too young at the time. And I certainly think these players coming out and becoming senior coaches in their mid-30s or whatever just don't have the life skills and have got young families and all these other things going on. It's another reason why I think a long apprenticeship actually helps. In terms of comparing it to everyday life, the great thing people can have, I think, is an ability to be able to do your work as hard as you can, be committed, all that, and be able to walk out the door and switch off. And no matter what you're doing, I think I've never been Prime Minister, but if you're Prime Minister of Australia, if you're a senior AFL coach, if you're running a gym, if you're a teacher, give it all you got, be as committed as you can possibly can, do whatever you can. But if you can walk out the door and turn off the phone or, turn yourself off, I suppose, and be able to relax and have something else to focus on, whether it be family or hobbies or, recreation or sport, exercise, that's all really important. And I think we play a very important part in people's lives. I see a lot of people, small business owners in a lot of our gyms, around the place, And I sometimes make a mistake of asking them how business is going. And I see the look on their face as if to say, why the hell would you ask me that? I'm here in the gym. So I try to avoid doing that. It's like when I was coaching footy and I'd go to my kids, barbecue at school or something, and I'd walk up and someone would say, what's going on at the Bulldogs? And I think to myself, this person is only, they're trying to be interested, they're trying to be all right. But the last thing in the world I want to do when I get outside the footy club is to talk to footy about it. We used to have a joke with our friends that, in footy at the time, we'd go to a dinner party or something, we'd say, okay, we've got 15 minutes, we're going to talk about footy. And after that, because in Melbourne, you go to a dinner party, everyone wants to, tell me about this player, or give me some dirt on someone else. And, I like telling a story like the best of them, but I don't want to go out all night and spend my whole time talking about footy. So we'd have a rule. We'd say after the entree, we can talk about footy. After that, no more footy. And I used to think I was rude saying that, but all our friends would appreciate it really in the end, because no one wants to be thought of as all you are as a football coach. Everyone wants to, I want to talk about family or friends or, other things that are going on around. I don't want to just talk about footy the whole time. And I think you're a very at-risk person if your whole life revolves around anything, and maybe highly committed, highly, motivated people in one area have to be that. But I think it's unhealthy for most people.
Very good advice.
Agreed.
Yeah. Well,
that's why I've got the grey hair, you see?
Yeah. Would if the Melbourne coach got sacked tomorrow and you were in the firing line, would you go back?
No.
No.
That was quick.
Look,
Hesitate.
when I was appointed coach of the Bulldogs, I was really excited about it and all. But even afterwards, I thought it's actually not a very healthy lifestyle. And as I said, look, there's 18 teams now in the AFL. If you look at the last AFL season, and I'm sure NRL is exactly the same, the team that wins a premiership, big tick. There's probably two other clubs who have got, like Hawthorn, who went from bottom of the ladder and made the finals. There might be another club somewhere that's, it's improved. But everybody else has had a disappointing year, Port Adelaide, who I've been involved with, bloody hell, Ken Hinkley, I've got a lot of time for. He won, they finished second on the ladder, and they still want a second coming in, and they end up making the prelim final. So they're third out of 18, and yet 75% of the supporters want to be sacked, which is just ridiculous. So it's just a very unhealthy environment. I mean,
it's deemed as the large majority of the industry's failing. Giannis Akalumpo, whatever his name is, that plays for the Milwaukee Bucks in the NBA, was talking about how one of the reporters said, do you see this season as a failure? And he just shook his head and looked in between the eyes, and he's like, if you don't get a promotion at work every year, do you see that as a failure? And I can't remember. I just saw it the other day. Jace, you probably saw it. And I was like, that is fantastic. He's just brought it all back in and just put things in perspective. Like you said earlier, Peter, like only one team can win. And being a Bulldog supporter, I've done my fair share of losing, which probably helps, where I think a Crows supporter, sorry, Jace, they started off with a lot of early success, so they had very high expectations. And I'm a realist. Like, you're going to lose just as much as you win if you're lucky. It's become pretty, I don't know, horrible in a way. The way it's everyone's.
You've got to be a bit realistic, don't you?
Yeah.
Like you've got to be realistic about your team. So I'm sitting opposite Parramatta Stadium here in the park. My team hasn't won since 1986. I'm all right with it. Getting a bit old, but I'm all right with it.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit like Wade's situation. You really do appreciate it. They're bloody hard to win, and the thing is now that with drafts and salary caps and all those sort of things, the competition's so much more even. It's really hard. It's really hard to win, and there's 18 teams and only one wins.
They keep adding teams too. That only makes it harder.
Yeah.
Pete kept this quiet. He hasn't said it yet, but Pete did win a flag as the head coach at Norwood Footy Club in 1997, Pete.
Yes, I did, and that was an amazing. I will say the thing about people ask me about that, and that's a good example, is that Norwood hadn't won a premiership for a long time. In 1996, we got beaten on the siren by a kick in a prelim final, and then the next year we won a lot of games throughout the year, but we lost the second semi. But we were favourites, so we went in that game, probably favourites, and when we won, it was more relief than as a coach than anything. The players, it's just wow, and the days afterwards, it's about. You get a lot of a warm, fuzzy feeling, I suppose, but it's a lot more to do with relief. And, there's a lot to be said for how hard they are to win. So when you win them, you got to remember to appreciate them, and you got to, and it's still the the greatest achievement of my life. When I look back at it, other than children and all the other things, But sporting wise, SANFL Premiership was and the day, but certainly the year building up to that, I have very fond memories of the whole year, and because it finished off successfully, that's my warmest memory of it all.
When the Bulldogs finally won the flag, the weeks after, it's sort of like, now what? I guess you just try and win it again.
Yeah.
Like it was a weird feeling going into that next season. Like if I was a player, I don't know how I would have been as motivated.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Like I said, probably Melbourne's the club that's closest to my heart, and they when they won in the COVID year in Perth, like it was in some ways the best way to win it, because everyone was at home in Melbourne in particular, like all the family and friends and all my ex-teammates. They're all locked up at home, literally. So it was all they had to hang their hats on. And the run into the finals and the finals, it was a massive win. But in another way, for Melbourne Footy Club not to win a game at the MCG, they still haven't won a grand final at the MCG since 1964. So in some ways it was different. But when I first went to Melbourne in the 80s, like the board, the chairman and selectors, so Melbourne dominated in the late 40s. They won 7 premierships in the 50s. They won 60, 61 and 64 or something. So they won about 9 or 10 premierships out of 15 at one stage. But then they hadn't won one then for 40, 50 years. So the whole thing about Melbourne was we're the Melbourne Footy Club. We just win premierships in the early days. But longer it went was we're the poor old Melbourne Footy Club. We never win premierships. And, so it was an interesting culture in those days, because there was all these people that remembered the golden years and kept talking about them all the time, which frankly gave the current players a shits. But then it got to the stage where we're starting to appreciate how hard they are, and we should we should honour those people more and more, and sadly over the years, Ron Barassi and a lot of legends of the Melbourne Footy Club have pretty much all passed away now. But a lot of those guys played in 7 premierships in 9 years or something, which is just ridiculous when you think about it now.
Yeah. But that perspective thing is everything. Like I'm going to take this back to the gym and measuring stuff, bit left field, but it just makes me think of, and I was going to say it before, when you're measuring all the data all the time. Like I've got a member in here, she's very accomplished, and she did a body scan a while back and everything was pretty much perfect. And then we got the body scan machine back again, and she said, I was going to do it, but and it's going to measure the same, really. There's nothing more she can do. And she's like, it sort of sucks. Like I can't really have a goal of improving anything. And it was just interesting, because I'm like, yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because all these people are getting these numbers they don't like, and they're like, oh, this sucks. I'm going to have to do all this change. But then someone's reached the pinnacle and they're like, oh, this sucks. Like I've got nothing to work towards. So just a little quirky analogy I've worked in there.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Pete. That was really good, interesting chat. Thank you. I mean, you're behind the scenes pulling the strings at EFM anyway, so you'll have editorial control over this. I'm sure it'll come out really good.
I just want to say well done to the three of you for putting the time in it. Well, a lot of people talk about what they're going to do, but for you get in and actually do it. And I've got to say, I've only listened to the first 3, so I'm a few behind now. Boys, you've pumped a few out pretty quick, but they're entertaining. So it's a matter of how we keep building the the people who listen to it. It seems to me the podcast, it has to be a slow burn. You got to get people to get used to listening to it, and, putting them out regularly, and hopefully we can keep engaging more with our current members and also use it as a tool for attracting members. So well done.
All right, that is the EFM Health Club podcast for another week. Thanks a lot. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
See you, fellas.